Well, here we continue with the audio lecture on the first module of modern art. And when we left off, we were talking about the Futurists. And I want to return to that so as not to rush, because it's fascinating. First off, the work is pretty interesting. Umberto Buccini, he was one of the founding members of the Futurist movement. And the sculpture to the left is called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. And to be honest, I loved that sculpture until I read the manifesto, which I'm going to repeat because it's fascinating. So the Futurists believed that the world had speeded up so much that humans had fundamentally changed. And they wrote a manifesto, as many of the groups of the time did. The Surrealists had theirs. This is the manifesto of the Futurists. And he says in the manifesto that we will glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world. We will destroy museums and fight against all utilitarian cowardice. So there was a little fella named Mussolini, and he was a fascist who was running Italy and allied with Hitler in World War II. He was inspired by the Futurists. So when I read that, when I learned that, I lost my taste for this style of art, although it's still a pretty darn interesting sculpture. Hey, let's talk about Pablo Picasso. One of the best known and most productive artists of the 20th century was actually our buddy Pablo. Now, some people say to me, oh, I don't like Picasso. You have to know everything about him before you can make that as an informed choice. Look at this painting on the left. Pretty nice, huh? For those of you that like the academic style. Well, he painted that when he was 15 years old. He was born in Picasso was born in 1881 in southern Spain, and his father was an accomplished artist and a well-known art professor. So when he was 15, his family moved to Barcelona so their son, Pablo, could develop his gifts. Now, the painting on the left was painted at this time. Then the painting on the right was painted when he was 49. Now, let's consider this for a moment. Once an artist has learned to paint realistically, perfectly realistically, as we saw with the academic style, what in the world are they going to do next? So with Pablo Picasso, really by the time he was 16 or 17 years old, he had sort of mastered realism. And you can imagine as he rebelled in early adulthood, he sought something more, of a greater measure, something that would push him continually throughout his life. And so what he did was he went to abstraction. Let's look at a bit more of Picasso's work, shall we? He was a child prodigy, and under his father's instruction, as I just said, he mastered these academic techniques. But then he became bored with them, and he was inspired to explore other creative endeavors. When he was 19, he left Spain to explore the avant-garde art scene that was currently happening in Paris. Now, when he was here, he was strongly influenced by the work of the post-impressionists, as you can see in the painting above left. I love this painting, actually. It was the picture of an art dealer, and it was painted when Picasso was 20. Throughout his life, Picasso constantly changed styles and approaches to making art. And I think that's important to remember. If anyone is an artist, we can always change and grow. The middle painting is called Boy with a Pipe, and it was painted when Picasso was 25. To the right is an etching called The Frugal Repast that was painted in 1904. So let's see, that would be when he was 25 also, 24 years old. Now here he's beginning to paint figures that are representational, that are less representational than in his early work. I like to look at The Frugal Repast because this was painted at a time when he was really struggling. He was in Paris, he was trying to make it as an artist, and he was probably going hungry some of the time. So then he did this etching to reflect that. Soon after he arrived in Paris as a young man, he entered what is known as the Blue Period. Here's a self-portrait at age 20 on the left. Now, Picasso's work was actually well received in Paris, but he was not content. He was always wanting to try new things. In 1907, he embarked in a revolutionary new direction called Cubism, which he developed with his friend George Braque. Hey, if somebody were to ask you who developed Cubism, here's what you want to say: Braque and Picasso. You want to write that down? Be a good idea. Braque, B-R-A-Q-U-E, and Picasso. They came up with Cubism. Remember that. Okay, now back to this. The piece to the left is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and it was his first effort at Cubism. In this painting, his fascination with primitive art is quite obvious, as he was fascinated with African masks and the whole African tradition in general. He's broken up the planes into extremely simple shapes. While it's confusing to the eye, the artist meticulously planned his work, painting it over and over again, which is hard to imagine when we're looking at this seemingly random, jagged painting. When it was first shown, the critics and the viewing public were shocked. A critic said that it resembled a field of broken glass. Now, as with Impressionists, the critics said this insulting name of Cubism, and that became the name for the new style of art that Picasso would continue to develop for many years. Let's talk for a minute about Guernica. Now, Guernica, again, you might want to really remember what I'm talking about for your final. As tension in Europe increased in the 1930s, Picasso began to paint images that reflected his despair at the seemingly senseless violence. In the spring of 1937, the town of Guernica, the ancient capital of the Basque people, was bombed by the Nazis. Now, the Nazis were just experimenting with a new technique of saturation bombing. They wanted to try it out and see what happened. So as a result, thousands of innocent civilians were killed. This painting, which is 11.5 inches high and 25 feet 8 inches long, huge, was Picasso's reaction to the violence. While it isn't a picture of the actual bombing, it is his emotional reaction to the senselessness of war. Even though he painted it prior to World War II, the saturation bombing that started at Guernica would become a standard practice of the Nazis. Now, it was created originally for the Spanish pavilion at the Paris Expo, the 1938 Paris Expo, but it had to be hidden away for years. It was actually smuggled to New York because it was too political to be shown at the time. Now, one of this week's movies is about Georgia O'Keeffe, who we'll return to. She was featured in our first slide, and here she is again. She had a strong spirit and a unique style. She had a very long career. She died in her 90s, and she worked from the 1920s all the way through, I think she died in the 70s. But what's nice to see about her, I really enjoy reading her work and studying her because she was so feisty, and she's working in a male-dominated environment, yet she did work in her own way. And one of the people that made her success possible was Alfred Stieglitz. So if somebody was to ask you the question, who is Georgia O'Keeffe married to? Probably the best answer, Alfred Stieglitz. To the left is one of his photos, Spring Showers from 1904. And above is a very famous photograph called The Steerage. This was showing the immigrants as they arrive in the U.S. Actually, they're still on the boat, but he was actually up above and he shot down into the hold with his camera. Now, what Stieglitz did was he helped to create photography as an art form. If you think about it, it was very new and it was so revolutionary. People didn't really know what photography was for. So at first they set up these vignettes and they tried to sort of copy paintings. Then they figured out that they could shoot scenes, and there was the whole photojournalism part of photography that exposed things like child labor. But Stieglitz came along and said, this is a valid art form in its own right. And he created beautiful photographs. I really enjoy his photos of New York City, of which this is one, but some of them really show the horses and It's kind of crude, but you can imagine the manure on the streets and the sounds and the mud and everything that was going on that made up the New York City of the early 1900s. So let's look for a minute at a couple of American realists. This is a famous painting called The Nighthawks, painted by Edward Hopper. Now, Edward Hopper is an interesting guy because no matter what he painted, it always looks a little sad. He has this stark depiction of space, and he was able to appeal to these fans of modern art even with his realism. In all of his work, the simplest scenes always feel kind of sad and stark. He is a master at portraying isolation, as we see in this piece. Now lastly, let's look at this piece by one of my favorite American Impressionists, Henry O. Tanner, called The Thankful Poor. It was painted around 1895, but look at all the colors that he uses and how he uses light to create the mood. Now what we have to remember about Henry O. Tanner is because he was African American, he really achieved most of his success in Europe and was not as honored in this country as he was in Europe. This concludes, The Thankful Poor concludes the lecture on the first part of modern art. Thanks for listening.